Hello and welcome back. In the previous chapter we looked at how a contract was formed. In this chapter we're going to look at what happens to bring a contract to an end. And again, you'd expect to see maybe 2 or 3 questions in your exam testing this chapter. Now this table shows you that there are 3 sort of main ways in which a contract will be brought to an end. The first one is the way that we expect most contracts to end, and that is performance. Now, in order to discharge a contract, you need full and complete performance by both parties. So if you have a builder building you an extension, he builds the extension you asked him for, and he finishes off everything exactly as you'd agreed. That's what usually happens. And as a result of that, you'll pay him the full amount that you owe him. We might also sometimes have contracts that are substantially complete. Let's imagine that your builder does all the work you asked him to do, but he forgets to put a little piece of skirting board behind the back door. Now, in that case, he hasn't quite finished the contract, and under the old law, that would have been a breach of contract. But under the new law, it's agreed that actually, to be honest, as a modern position, odd little bits might be left out. That is, substantial performance is enough to discharge the contract. Now, the only caveat there is that you don't have to pay him the full amount. You can actually withhold from the payment the cost of getting that little piece of skirting board and sticking it to the wall. So you can take as effectively as damages the cost of putting right the bit that wasn't done. Now, you may occasionally, and this is quite rare, have what we call partial performance. And this means that the contract is only completed up to a certain point. Now, we can only treat this as a discharge of the contract if we have what's called a severable contract. That means a contract that is in parts, if you like. Perhaps you've employed a builder to build you 3 houses. He's built the first one, it's finished. We therefore could sever the contract and not go ahead with parts 2 and 3, the second and third houses. That is actually quite rare. Now, that's a relatively straightforward position discharge of a contract, so you won't be surprised to know that for most of this chapter we're going to be looking at these 2 here: frustration of contract and breach of contract. Well, frustration is a special legal term, and it applies where a contract that was originally perfectly possible to carry out has become impossible to perform. Something has happened which has meant that contract can't be delivered. And in that case, the law says the contract is discharged by frustration, and there is an act which sets out how that sort of damages and losses will fall there. And then finally, if a contract isn't discharged, then the parties are going to be in breach. If the parties haven't done what they said they would, they haven't fulfilled their obligations under the contract, we'll be looking for remedies for breach of contract. Now, you may just occasionally hear this phrase, quantum meruit. And this applies where one party stops the other side completing his contract. And although the contract isn't officially severable, the courts have decided that in certain circumstances it would be reasonable for the injured party to claim payment for the work that he's done. And quantum meruit, as you can see there, means as much as he deserved. So the lead case on that is a very old case called klawch v. Colburn. And in that case, Colburn was engaged to write a series of books. He did some research, started the work on the book, but then abandoned the series. Now, although his completion fee was £100, he hadn't earned that because he hadn't completed the contract. But as he was prevented from completing the project, he was entitled to claim a payment for the work that he'd actually done. Reasonable remuneration under the principle of quantum meruit. And in that case, reasonable remuneration was held to be 50 guineas. Now, discharge by frustration then. So this is where it becomes impossible for the parties to complete a contract. And first of all, key point, it must have been possible and legal when it was entered into. And it mustn't be possible to complete the contract in a different way. If you can still do the contract, but only in a way that will incur a lot more costs, so long as the contract is still possible, that contract will not be discharged. And there is a case that illustrates that, where it was intended that a delivery of certain cargo would be made down the Suez Canal. When the Suez Canal was closed, the ship owners tried to argue that the contract was discharged because it was no longer possible to make the delivery. But the court said no, there was a long way round, and the ship owners could still fulfil the contract by taking the longer route. So that's the sort of thing that we're looking for here. Now, quite often in a complex contract, the parties will agree what will happen if the contract becomes impossible to complete. And we might call that a force majeure provision. And what that says, if there is a major force which interferes with the delivery of the contract, then this is what we'll do. So for instance, if you go to Wimbledon and the weather is really, really bad, there is a provision in the terms and conditions of Wimbledon tickets that says how much of a repayment you will get depending on how much tennis you actually see. Force majeure. Now, in terms of the exam, it's quite likely that the examiner will test you to see if you understand what might cause a frustration of contract. So these cases here can be quite important. So here are some examples that in Taylor v Caldwell, the contract was for the rental of a village hall, which then burned down. Clearly didn't exist, it couldn't be the subject of the contract was discharged through frustration. Another common one is personal incapacity. Now this is where the contract is one for personal service, and the lead case on that is a drummer in the band Barron Knights, and he had RSI, which if you're a drummer I guess is a bit of a problem. He couldn't use his wrist properly. So the doctors said that he could only perform for 4 nights in a row instead of 7. And the court said, well, that frustrated his contract with the band. They were therefore able to treat the contract as discharged and employ a different drummer. Government intervention, for instance, the outbreak of war or new legislation, will also frustrate a contract. Imagine if you had a contract to supply cigarette machines to various pubs. The legislation has now been changed. It's not possible to have cigarette machines in pubs, and therefore your contract would be frustrated. And then finally, non-occurrence of an event. Now, the thing there is the event must be the sole purpose of the contract. And the lead cases there are to do with the King's coronation. And in that case, a room was let so that the contracting parties could sit in the room and watch the coronation procession walk past the room, a bit like we saw with the royal wedding. And because the king was ill on his day of his coronation, the procession was cancelled. And for that reason, the contract was frustrated because it was for the purpose of viewing the procession. Now, it's interesting, there was another case about the same time where a contract was entered into to watch a salute to the king on the day of his coronation, and it was to go on a boat tour, to tour around all the assembled naval fleet in the harbour, and then to sort of moor up and watch this royal salute. Now, because the king was ill, the royal salute didn't happen. However, it was still possible to go on the boat tour and view the assembled fleet. And for that reason, that contract was not frustrated, because the sole purpose was not to see the king. Now, as I mentioned, the Act says what will happen where a contract is frustrated. Now, to me, this always seems a very fair and sensible provision. First of all, if you've paid anything under the contract already, for instance, a deposit to rent the room to watch the royal procession, then that money should be repaid. And if you owe anything in the future, obviously that's not payable because the contract is not going ahead. And then we have these next two provisions, which I think are very fair. And they say that if someone has to repay the money, maybe a deposit, or forego a payment that he should have received before that frustrating event, then if the court considers it just in all the circumstances, so basically if it's fair, then the court will arrange for the party to be reimbursed some of his expenses that were incurred in getting ready for that contract. Which seems fair, doesn't it? If you've incurred some costs, they shouldn't all fall on one party. Similarly, so sort of the flip side of that, if one party has actually benefited from the contract up until the date when it was discharged, then the court can order him to share some of that benefit with the other party. And again, it's the amount that it considers just, having regard to all the circumstances of the case. Now, the case on that, relatively modern case in contract law terms, BP Expiration Co. Now, in this case, Mr. Hunt owned an oil concession, so he had the right to explore for oil and to extract oil. And this concession was in Libya. Now, the BP had a contract with Mr. Hunt to allow them to actually explore the oil field and to start to extract oil. Now, they found a large oil field, started to put the pipelines in place, and then the Libyan government, would you believe it, cancelled the concession. So government intervention frustrated the contract. Now, the parties went to court, and the court said that Mr. Hunt had received a valuable benefit, and they reckon that benefit was $85 million. And the reason he'd had that benefit was because his oil concession has actually gone up in value as a result of the discovery of the oil and the pipelines that have been laid. So he was going to get a payment of compensation from the Libyan government, good luck in getting hold of that, and therefore the court said he needed to share some of that profit with BP, because they'd incurred the costs of exploring the concession and laying some basic pipes, and therefore it was fair that they should be able to share in some of the upside that was going to accrue to Mr. Hunt. So that's frustration of contracts. Now, you remember in my little boxes at the start, I had 3 boxes, and the third one was breach of contract. Now, breach of contract is where one party doesn't perform his obligations properly, either not at all or doesn't quite finish them off to the required standard. Now, unless he has a lawful excuse, he will be treated as being in breach of contract, which should result in some sort of damages being payable. So, what is a lawful excuse? Well, it's where he's tried to complete the contract, but basically the other side have made it difficult for him to do so. So perhaps your builder turned up and tried to get into your house to finish his little bit of skirting board, to finish off the extra jobs, but you've decided his work is shoddy, you don't want him in your house anymore, you've rejected it, you won't let him in. So if you say no, or if you basically just change the locks, lock the door, don't let him in, don't let him come and do that work, then he's going to have a lawful excuse. What may also happen is that the parties will agree not to complete the contract. So imagine, for instance, you have a builder, and I know someone who had this problem. They had a builder, they did a lot of work, but the windows they'd fitted were pretty shoddy. And in the end, my friend said to the builder, look, you can either come back, take all those windows out and refit them properly, or you can go away and I won't pay you the last instalment of your bill, and I'll get someone else to finish the windows off for me. And in that scenario, the builder decided to go away. He decided that by agreement he would not complete the contract and he would forego his element of consideration, the extra payment, and my friend would forego having the builder complete the work to the required standard. Therefore, you almost have a contract that agrees to discharge the contract early. Now, if you do have a breach of contract, there are 2 sorts of breaches that we need to be concerned with. The first one is repudiatory breach. Now, this is where the breach is so important, so significant, that it goes right to the heart of the contract. Now, in legal terms, we say that the breach is so big that it deprives the injured party of substantially the whole benefit of the contract. So basically the contract is not what it was meant to be. We also have a term called anticipatory breach. Now, this is where there hasn't actually been a breach of contract yet, but one party has told the other one that he isn't going to honour the contract. So, for instance, if you've booked to come on a classroom course with me, I tell you that I won't be there, I won't be able to teach that classroom course. Therefore, that is an anticipatory breach. If you were to turn up on the day of the course and I'm not there, that would be an actual breach of contract. Now, where you have an anticipatory breach, the injured party has a choice. As soon as you know I'm not going to turn up on that course, you can treat the contract as discharged and you can sue me for damages. So basically, it'll be your money back for the course. Or you could wait. You could wait until the day of the course and see if I do actually turn up, see if I actually do breach the contract, and if I do, you can take action at that time. Now, there is a bit of a quirk here with anticipatory breach, because what's normally the case is once somebody has breached the contract, they have a duty to mitigate their losses, to keep their losses as low as they possibly can. But if it's an anticipatory breach, you don't have to do that until the date of the actual breach. Now, that means that if you, for instance, had entered into a contract to do some print work for a client, and the client tells you they're not going to pay you, then even though they've told you that, you have the option to carry on doing the job, complete the order, and then when the client doesn't pay you, you can sue them for the full amount that should have been paid to you under the contract. Now, the lead case on anticipatory breach is this case klawch2 v. de la Tour. Really, it's just a case where de la Tour was employed as a courier, a holiday courier, and he should have started work on the 1st of June. On the 11th of May, the defendant cancelled the contract, and klawch2 immediately took action for breach of contract. De la Tour's response was, well, we haven't breached the contract yet, we might use him after all. But the court said no, as soon as they told him that they weren't going to need him, that was a breach of contract, and therefore klawch2 could take action at that date. Now, assuming we have a repudiatory breach, a significant breach that justifies action, what can we do? Well, if it's a repudiatory breach, a big one, we can treat our contract as discharged, so we don't have to continue with a contract. And first thing we have to do is tell the other side. So we think they've breached their contract, so we therefore notify them that we think they've committed a repudiatory breach, and therefore we don't want to continue with the contract. Now, ideally, we'd sort of serve some sort of notice on them, but we don't have to do that. That could be evidenced by our own behaviour, perhaps in returning goods that have been delivered to us. Now, the effect of discharge is quite important. So let's imagine we have a timeline here, and we have a repudiatory breach. Let's say it was on the 1st of January 2014. What happens? Well, we can treat the contract as discharged from that date. But any obligations that we incurred before that date still apply. But anything after that date won't apply anymore. Therefore, anything after this date, we don't have to pay for it. So we needn't perform the contract, and we needn't pay for the contract. However, we do have to pay for this early stuff. Now, if the contract's gone wrong, the chances are we haven't really had very good service in this early part of the contract. So if the performance up to the date of breach has been defective, then we can seek to recover damages. Or we could try and reclaim some of the money that we've already paid. Okay, so anything up to the breach, potentially the damages, the payments are still enforceable. Anything after the breach, then we needn't pay. Even though we do need to pay for stuff before the breach, we could be seeking damages if performance wasn't very good. Now, what are the remedies available for breach of contract? Well, most people are looking for damages, and this is the main common law remedy under a breach of contract. The purpose of damages is to put the parties in the position they would have been in if the contract had been correctly performed. So we're not looking to pay people huge sums of money for inconvenience and so on. What we're looking for is to put them in a position as if nothing had gone wrong, as if the contract had been properly done. Now, there's a two-part test to look at here. One of them we call remoteness of damage, and the second test, the measure of damages. So the remoteness is kind of how far down the chain of causation do you go? At some point you have to say, well, it's not really fair to make that original party to the contract liable for all the losses that you suffered. And the other one, the measure, is really about how much damage and what should be covered. So let's look first of all at the remoteness of damage test. Now, there are two key cases here, the Hadley and Baxendale case and the Victoria Laundry case. And these two cases have established that damages will only be awarded if they arise naturally. They are a natural consequence of the breach of contract, And if they're not reasonably foreseeable, then the defendant will only be liable if he should have known about them. He should have known that that particular loss was a likely result of his breach of contract. And the best way to illustrate those 2 points is really with these 2 cases. So Hadley and Baxendale, in this case, Hadley owned a mill, and the mill crankshaft had broken. So they took the crankshaft out of the mill and they sent it away to be used as a template to make a new crankshaft. And they engaged the defendant, Baxendale, to deliver the crankshaft for its repairs to be used. So Baxendale didn't take the crankshaft on the first trip that he made, and it sat there for a while waiting for delivery. Therefore, the mill was out of action for quite a long period, and the mill owners sued Baxendale for their loss of profits for the period when they had to wait for him to get round to delivering their broken mill shaft. However, their claim failed, because the court said the loss of profits was not a natural consequence of this delay. There was no way that Baxendale could have known that the mill couldn't operate without this crankshaft. They might have assumed, for instance, that the mill had a spare. And therefore, the claimants couldn't recover those damages for loss of profit, even though it's pretty clear that the loss of profit was caused by Baxendale's delay. Compare that to the case Victoria Laundry. It's very similar, really. In this case, the defendants had entered into a contract to supply a huge boiler for use in a Victoria Laundry. And they knew that this laundry was needed immediately. It was written into the contract that immediate use. So they knew that C needed the boiler immediately, and they knew that they couldn't actually carry on their business without the boiler. Now, they were really, really late delivering the parts for this boiler, and therefore the laundry, Victoria Laundry, claimed for their loss of profits during the period of delay. Now, the court said that that loss of profits was totally foreseeable, and the defendant should have known about that, and therefore it could be recovered from the defendant. So Newman were liable for the loss of profits. But in this case, there was something in what we call abnormal profits, in that the claimant, the laundry, had to turn down a highly lucrative dyeing contract. So they'd been offered an extra contract during this period when the laundry was out of action, and they couldn't accept the work. So they sued for the loss of those profits as well. Now, in this case, the court called those abnormal profits, and they said they weren't reasonably foreseeable because the defendant had no knowledge that this particular contract would come along and that it could have been very lucrative for Victoria Laundry. Okay, so you can recover for normal profits, but not for abnormal profits, because they're not in the reasonable contemplation of the parties. Now, armed with that knowledge, have a look at this question and see what you think. So Louise here runs a cake business, and she has Cook & Co. have a contract to sell her a large oven. And they know that oven is to allow her to expand her business and increase cake production. She tells Cook & Co. that she's got a new contract to bake 100 jacket potatoes daily, and she needs the oven by the 31st of October. Cook & Co. agree to deliver it before that date. They don't know that Louise also has a deal to let Bob the baker use the oven, and the oven is delivered late. Louise can't fulfil the jacket potatoes contract, she can't increase cake production, and she's lost the higher payment that she agreed with Bob. What is the legal position of Cook & Co.? Well, first of all, would Cook & Co. be liable for the losses that she has suffered? Well, she had a loss of profits. That's normal profits, isn't it? And therefore, they should be liable for that. They knew about it. It was reasonably foreseeable. She also had the baked potato contract. Again, Cook & Co. knew about that contract, therefore we could call that normal as well. It was reasonably foreseeable, therefore they're liable for those profits too. However, they didn't know about Bob, and therefore the rental payments would be what we might call abnormal profits, and therefore they are not liable for those profits. So that's the first test. That is the test of remoteness of damage. The second test is the measure of damage. Well, there's two ways we can measure damages. One is what we call the expectation interest. Now, the purpose of the expectation interest is to put the person in the position that he would have been in if the contract had been performed. That's the initial definition of damages that I gave you. That is the most common approach. But sometimes it's not possible to follow that approach, and we have to do something else, which is called the reliance interest. So what we would do here is we'd say, well, we can't work out what profits you would have made if this contract had been performed. However, we can cover the costs that you've incurred as a result of your relying on this contract. And that's what happened in the Anglia TV case. In this case, Anglia TV engaged Reed to appear in a new film they were making. And at the last minute, he pulled out, he got a better offer. So Anglia TV couldn't claim damages on the expectation interest because they didn't know how profitable this project would be. So instead of that, they said, well, we've incurred a lot of costs and we would like to recover those. So they sued for the preparatory expenditure of the programme, so marketing, drawing up the script, hiring other actors, things like that, so that they could reclaim their out-of-pocket expenses. And obviously it was a smaller sum than their expectation interest, but it was the only amount they were able to prove. Now, what do damages relate to? Well, most of the time, damages apply for financial loss. Occasionally, you might try and recover damages for things like mental distress and loss of enjoyment. Now, there are very limited situations where you can recover those damages, and that is where the principal purpose of the contract is the provision of employment. Provision of employment, enjoyment even. So what I'm looking at there is things like holiday contracts, maybe even wedding photos. You know, in that case, the cost of the photographs, of actually replacing photos, is pretty small, but the enjoyment that you were going to get from those photos would far exceed the cost of the photographs themselves. And the lead case on that is Jarvis v Swan Tours. And in this case, the claimant, Jarvis, had entered into a contract for a holiday. It's basically a sort of ski-type holiday. And he was promised that he would have afternoon tea, an English-speaking host, and musical entertainment. Unfortunately, what he got was far inferior to that. He had a host who could barely speak English, afternoon tea was some dried-up fruit cake, and the entertainment apparently was very shoddy. So his financial loss was only £32, but, you know, this was his annual holiday. This was his only holiday. He'd given up his hard-earned cash and his time off work for this holiday, and therefore he was entitled to 3 times that sum as compensation for his disappointment and distress because he hadn't been able to enjoy this contract. So you can recover damages for mental distress, but it is actually quite limited, so take care with that one. Now, I mentioned earlier that once a contract has been breached, with the exception of anticipatory breach, you have a duty to mitigate your loss. Now, that means you must take all reasonable steps to reduce or mitigate your loss, so to keep your loss as low as possible. You can't just say, well, they've breached contract, I'm going to run up lots and lots of costs now because the other side are going to pay for those. They're not. But note there the use of the word reasonable. We use that a lot in law. And that means that you're don't have to do anything risky. You don't have to do anything discreditable. You don't have to go to great lengths. You just have to be sensible about your losses. Now, if the defendant thinks that you haven't mitigated your losses, you haven't reduced your losses suitably, then it's up to him to show that that's the case. Now, again, the case that we often quote here, quite an old case, Paisley versus Saunders. And in this case, there was a contract for goods to be delivered and paid for by instalments. And because the claimant were late making the first payment on the delivery of goods, the defendants decided that they would only make delivery in future if they were paid cash in advance. Now, the case went to court, and the claimant said, well, the defendants are in breach of contract because they have changed the terms of our contract. They're only delivering if they get cash in advance. And the defendants said, well, no, because the claimants had breached the contract by failing to pay for the first instalment, and therefore they had repudiated the contract. The court said that actually the breach hadn't been significant enough to repudiate the contract, so you couldn't reject the contract just because a payment was late. But they also went on and said, well, the claimant didn't actually mitigate their loss. They didn't try and minimise their loss because they could have accepted this cash payment, this cash on delivery. And therefore, their damages were capped at their assumed loss if they'd accepted these new terms of delivery from the defendant. Now, in practice, what does mitigation mean? I mean, for instance, if you are dismissed from your job, part of your duty to mitigate your losses would be to carry on looking for a suitable job. You can't just sit at home and claim expenses whilst you're there. Now, have a look at question 7. In this case, we've got Chana, who agrees to buy a car from Mike's Motors for £6,000. Mike's paid £5,500 for the car. On the agreed day, Chana won't accept and pay for the car. But in the meantime, the value has gone up, and Mike's able to sell it for actually more than he had in the original contract. So what is Mike's claim for damages against Chana? Well, Chana is in breach. She had a contract to buy the car for £6,000. She didn't buy it. So the damages that Mike might have been able to claim there would have been the difference between the £6,000 that Chana should have paid him and the £5,500 that it cost him for the car, because he already had the car. i.e., what would he have made if the contract had gone ahead as planned? However, look at these values. The car's value has gone up to £7,000, and actually Mike sold it for £7,500. So because he's mitigated his losses here, he hasn't actually lost out at all. He sold it for more than his original contract. Therefore, Mike hasn't made a loss. Therefore, the damages that Mike can claim is going to be nothing. Now, what he might get is something that we sometimes call nominal damages. And that really is just a slap on the wrist for Chana. You breached your contract, you need to pay some damages, but it won't be anything like the amount that was due under the contract. It's more of a token. Now, sometimes, rather than rely on the courts to decide what damages are payable, the parties might try and agree up front what damages will be paid in the event of a breach of contract. Now, if they do that, we call the damages liquidated damages. So it says there a pre-estimate of the potential damages written into the contract. Now, if you do that, that's fine. The courts will accept it, provided it's a genuine attempt to estimate the likely loss. If you go too far and the damages that you write into your contract are actually deemed to be excessive, the courts will call the clause a penalty clause. And if it's a penalty clause, the courts will strike it out. It's not enforceable, and you then fall back onto normal contract law principles. So the problem here is that it's quite hard to work out all the things that might go wrong with a contract when you're first drawing up that contract. Quite often, things that go wrong aren't the things you envisaged at all. Even harder is to work out what your potential loss might be if the contract goes wrong. So it can be quite difficult to come up with genuine liquidated damages. And that is exactly what happened in the case Ford Motor Company. So in this case, the defendant said he wouldn't sell Ford's cars at below their list price, and he wouldn't sell them to other dealers, and he wouldn't display any Ford cars without permission. And every single breach that he committed of those three things would result in a £250 penalty. Now, the court looked at this contract and they said, well, this penalty was not a genuine pre-estimate of damages because This penalty was the same no matter what sort of breach had been committed. Didn't matter which car, didn't matter whether he'd sold it to someone else or he'd sold them at below list price. Therefore, it couldn't be a genuine pre-estimate of loss. Therefore, it was a penalty clause and unenforceable. Now we have a worked example there for you to have a look at. Edith and Furaha are negotiating the terms of a contract, and Furaha is fitting out Edith's shop. She's due to open on the 1st of June, but she worked out that if the shop opens late, she will lose out on £400 worth of profits per day. So she wants to put a clause in the contract that says for every day that the work overruns, she's going to have £400 of damages. Now, so long as the shop doesn't open and so long as that is a realistic estimate of damages, this is likely to be a genuine attempt to quantify Edith's loss. Therefore, it's likely to be enforceable. Now that brings us to the end of damages, and I think that's a good place for us to take a break, and we'll come back and look at some of the other remedies in the next lecture.